Up to this point in the course, we learned about pages and we learned about routing, and that Next.js helps us with routing and that it allows us to define a route structure and define our routes in general by setting up files and folders in the pages folder. But as you see here on this slide as well, Next.js is not just about routing. And that's also what I already explained in the first course section of this course. Whilst this is a major building block of Next.js, and whilst this is already a pretty amazing feature that could be a good reason for using Next.js, it's not the only reason why we might want to use Next.js. Instead, Next.js helps us with building full-stack React apps, as I also mentioned before in the course already. And it helps us with that by, for example, pre-rendering pages on the server side. And that's important. And in this section, we're going to explore what exactly that means. But in the end, Next.js will help us with executing code not just on the client side, so in the React app that runs in the browsers of our users, but it helps us with running code on the server side as well. For example, for preparing data or for loading data that is then needed by the page that should be displayed. Therefore, this course section is about data fetching. It is about how Next.js helps us blend server-side with client-side code and why we might want to do that. And we're going to explore what exactly data fetching means and why it matters and how Next.js helps us with that. And we're then specifically going to explore static generation versus server-side generation, what these concepts are and when to use which and how to use them, of course. And we're going to see how exactly we do prepare and fetch data with Next.js and how that differs from traditional React apps. Now for this section, I want to start with a traditional React app, and I want to come back to one of the main assets, one of the main reasons for using Next.js, which I did already talk about in the first course section as well. This here is a dummy page rendered by a standard React application. To be precise, by this React application here. I just created a very simple React app with one component, the app component, and there I fetch data from a dummy backend, which is a JSON file in my public folder, which is therefore served by this development server. And in there I got some dummy data, but the important thing is that I'm not loading the data in my JavaScript code by importing that file or anything like that, but that instead I send a HTTP request to that file once everything is up and running in the browser. And then I load data, extract it, set my state, and render the data. Now, what we see therefore is that dummy data on the screen, but if we then view the page source of this file, we see that on there, in this page source code, the data is nowhere to be found. We only got this empty div here with the ID root, which is the div in which our React application is actually rendered in. And we can see that rendered application if we inspect the page, where we then see the actual DOM as it's currently rendered. There, inside of the div with the ID root, we do see the unordered list with the list items. But that's only the DOM as it was rendered by JavaScript and by the React app, therefore, after we loaded this page. The actual HTML content served by the server, so loaded by the browser initially, is this HTML code instead. And that code did not include any data. Now that can have a couple of disadvantages, as I already mentioned in the first course section. For example, our users need to wait for the data to be loaded to actually see something on the screen. Now here that's super fast because that dummy backend file is served by my local development server, which runs on the same machine as the user is here during development. And therefore, we don't really see a difference here. But for real pages where we fetch data from some backend API, loading that data could take a second or so, and therefore we might have a delay. We might have a loading spinner, which our users have to see before the data arrives. So the user experience could be suboptimal when fetching data like this. Not necessarily, often it's fine, but it could be. Now, an even bigger problem could be search engine optimization though. If you are building an app where search engines like Google should be aware of your content, you'll have a problem, because this HTML code, which is initially sent back by the server to the client, that is what search engines will see. And in there, we got no content at all. So if our content matters, and we want search engines to see and index that content, sending back this is bad. Now again, that is not a problem for all websites and web apps. For example, if you have a web app where users need to log in anyways, if you have some admin dashboard built with React, then search engines might not matter to you because users are not going to find your page, your admin dashboard, through a search engine. But if you do have a content-heavy app, like a blog or a shop, then you of course typically do want search engines to find your content, and sending back something like this then is bad. Now, I did talk about that in the first course section already. I just wanted to bring it back into your memory because it does matter. That is an issue which we can have with standard React. And the problem is that we fetch data in our component after the component was loaded. So we fetch data from the client side, we send a request to the server after something was rendered to the screen. The initial response, the initial HTML page, which is sent back by the server to the client when the user first visits the page, does not yet contain that data. And that can be a problem. And that is something where Next.js, with its server-side capabilities and its built-in features, can help us. So I outlined a potential problem we could be facing in the last lecture. Now Next.js can help us with a concept called pre-rendering. Imagine that you have some page, some route, which then loads some page file in the pages folder, which needs data. Now when a request is sent to this route, so if a user wants to visit this page, then what Next.js does is it will return a pre-rendered page. And that's a difference to standard React. With standard React, you get back an empty HTML file and all the JavaScript code, and then that JavaScript code runs and brings something onto the screen, and that happens super fast, so users won't really see a problem there. But then any data which might be needed, in addition to the general DOM structure that should be shown, such data then is loaded from a server, and that can take a while. Now, not if the page is pre-rendered, and that is what Next.js does for us. Instead of loading data only after the page was sent back to the client, Next.js pre-renders a page and pre-renders all the HTML content with all the data that might be needed. It loads that in advance and then pre-generates the finished HTML page so that it's this finished, fully populated HTML page which can be sent back to the client, so to the visitor. So that's great for SEO. Now we also, of course, still want to have an interactive React app. After all, there is a reason why we use React, and we don't just build a HTML and CSS app. Instead, we might be using React for handling user interaction, for watching a forum and showing validation errors, for reacting to button clicks. And therefore, Next.js will not just send back this pre-rendered page, but it will also send back all the JavaScript code that belongs to it. And it will do something which is called hydrating that page. So it will send back that JavaScript code, and that code will then take over that pre-rendered page and again let React do its job. That is great because now we have an interactive page or app. But we did send back that pre-rendered page initially so that all the core content was already there right from the start, and so that search engine crawlers, for example, also see that entire page with all the content. If it's not interactive at that point, that doesn't matter to those crawlers because they are only interested in the content anyways. So that's the idea of pre-rendering. We, or to be precise, Next.js, prepare a page in advance by pre-building all the HTML content and by preloading all the data that will eventually be needed. And it is worth pointing out that this pre-rendering only affects the initial load. So when we visit a page and we load our first page, this page is pre-rendered. Once we are on a website that's powered by Next.js and React, and once that page is hydrated, which happens right after this first rendering, once that is the case, we have a standard single page application again. So then React takes over and handles everything on the front end. If the page changes thereafter, if we visit a different page of that same website, that page is not pre-rendered, but instead created in the client with React. It's just this initial page which we visit, which is pre-rendered, so that there we don't get this empty page until React is ready, but we get this pre-rendered page which contains all that initial content already. And for achieving this, Next.js has two forms of pre-rendering, and we are, of course, going to learn about both, which you can choose from. So you can choose which form you want to use. The first form, and the recommended form, is static generation. The other form, the alternative, is server-side rendering. Now, that might not tell you much right now. I will explain both throughout this section. The main difference is that with static generation, all the pages are pre-generated in advance during build time. So when you build your application for production, before you deploy it, you prepare all those pages. With server-side rendering, pages are created just in time after deployment when a request reaches the server. Now, there also are ways of mixing that, and I will dive deeply into both concepts and when to use which throughout this section. I hope it's clear what the core idea behind pre-rendering is, though, and therefore let's now explore these different concepts of pre-rendering pages. So let's explore this first form of pre-rendering or of data fetching with Next.js. And that would be the static generation, which I did mention is typically recommended, but of course I will explain all the details now and throughout this section. Now, with static generation, there is a simple idea. The idea is that you pre-generate a page during build time. And pre-generate means that all the HTML code and all the data that makes up the content is prepared in advance. So on the server side, though that can be confusing here, with that I really mean during the build process where you are allowed to execute code that would normally only run on the server side though. Code that interacts with the file system, for example. And you're going to see it in action very soon. So data and pages are prepared during build time, when you build your application before you deploy it. Now, because pages are then pre-built during build time, once you deployed them, they can be cached by the server, by the CDN that might be serving your app, and therefore incoming requests can be served instantly with those pre-built pages. Now, then, as I mentioned before, those pages after they were served are still hydrated with your React app. So you still have a regular React app in the end. The only difference is that the pages which are sent to your clients are not empty initially, but pre-populated with content. Thereafter, you can still do whatever you want to do. It's still a regular React app. So therefore now one main question, of course, is how do we tell Next.js that a certain page should be pre-generated? And how do we tell Next.js which data is needed to pre-generate a page? And the answer is, there is a specific function which we can export from inside our page components. And that's important, only from inside our page components, not from other React components, but only from inside the component files that live in our pages folder. From in there, we can export the special async function getStaticProps. Now, that name matters. It must be written exactly like this, getStaticProps, because that is then a function Next.js will watch out for. It's async, which means it returns a promise, and you can use the await keyword in there. And then the special thing is that in this function, you can run any code that would normally run on the server side only. So in that function, you don't run client-side code, you're not restricted to that, and you don't have access to certain client-side API, you don't have access to the window object, for example, but instead you can run any code you want that normally would only run on the server side. And even better than that, code that you write inside of this getStaticProps function will not be included in the code bundle that's sent back to your clients. So any code you put in there will never be seen by your clients. So if you, for example, have code in there that contains database credentials, you typically wouldn't want to expose those credentials on the client side. You can safely write it inside of getStaticProps because that code will never end up on the client side. And therefore, let's now take a closer look at that and let's start writing some code there so that we fully understand this function and how it works. Now to write some code, I'm back here in an empty Next.js project, which you again find attached to this lecture so that we all start with exactly the same starting state. It's very similar to the starting projects from the last course sections, but I did already add an index.js file in the pages folder, which lists some dummy content. Now, if we run npm install here, to install all dependencies, and then we run npm run dev, we bring up that development server again. And once I do that, we see product 1, product 2, product 3, and that's just the dummy content I have in there. Now, before we add this getStaticProps function, I already wanna show you something important. If we view the page source of this page here, so of this page generated by Next.js, then we see that it looks very different than what we had a look at before with the standard React app. And whilst this is a bit hard to read, we see that in there indeed, we do have the unordered list with the list items here. Here it is. We do have that in here in this page. And keep in mind that this page source we're seeing here is the actual response we got back from the server, in this case from the development server, when this page was loaded, when this request was initially sent. And that is the kind of content a search engine would see as well. And that's of course great, it already contains the content. Of course, this is not content that was fetched with useEffect or anything like that, but before in the React app, we didn't see any content, not just the content that was fetched with useEffect. We also didn't see an empty unordered list. We saw no content at all. Now we see all the HTML code, all the JSX code returned by our component. We see that here. And that already shows us that there is a difference. This page, which we're getting here with Next.js, was already pre-rendered by Next.js without us doing anything. It was already pre-rendered because by default, Next.js pre-renders all pages that have no dynamic data. And this page, of course, does not have any dynamic data. Everything here is just hard-coded. And if you have a page like this, Next.js will automatically pre-render it for you, which is great because now any content which you encode in your component will be visible to search engines and to your website visitors right from the start. So that's not even the main thing of this section, but it's already important. However, let's now get back to getStaticProps. The getStaticProps function can be added to any page file, and only there, as I mentioned, and you need to export it. And when you do so, then Next.js will also call this getStaticProps function on your behalf when it pre-generates a page. And this function also signals to Next.js that this is a page that should be pre-generated. Now, I just said that Next.js would pre-render any page by default, and that's true, but we'll later learn about a way of telling Next.js to not pre-render a page, and therefore it's important to understand that getStaticProps will not tell Next.js to not pre-render, but instead it kind of confirms to Next.js that this page still should be pre-generated. But in addition to just running through the component and returning the JSX code, Next.js will then also call this getStaticProps function if it finds one in your component file. So therefore here, let's say we want to load this product data dynamically, but not in the way we would do it in a standard React app with useEffect, what I showed you before. And therefore attached you find another file, the dummy backend JSON file, which is this example dummy file I used in the React example a second ago. And you should add that in your main project folder. Not in public, not in pages, just in your folder like this. Or actually maybe add a data folder. Whoops, a folder, not a file. Add a data folder and move that file into there so that you have a data folder. And in that data folder, you have the dummy backend JSON file. And now we want to load data from that file for this index.js file, but we don't want to load it through a HTTP request that's only sent from the client side after the page was loaded. Instead, we want to prefetch the data before we create this component and before this component page gets pre-rendered by Next.js. And that's exactly why we then add this function which we export, the async function called getStaticProps. And again, it needs to be called exactly like this. Now in this function, you then always need to return an object. An object that has a props key. Because the function is named getStaticProps. And actually what this function does is it prepares the props for your component, so this props object. It prepares that because Next.js, if you have a getStaticProps function in your file, will first execute this function, and then in a second step, execute the component function. Now, in a second step, because that first step prepares the props for this component function. And therefore, in this getStaticProps function, you can run any code you want. Again, code that will never be visible on the client side, that fetches data and exposes data through props to this homepage component. So here I could set props equal to an object, so that the props I get here are still an object, where I have my products, and that could be an array where I, for example, have one object in that array with an ID of P1 and a title of product 1. Something like this. So now getStaticProps returns an object with a props key. That's always required. You always must return an object with a props key. And then the data in the props key is up to you, but it should be an object. And here it's an object with a products key, which holds an array of product objects. And now we'll receive that here on props on this home page because Next.js first calls this getStaticProps function and then executes this component function. And it does both things in advance. So none of that code here runs on the client side. Instead, that all happens during build time or in development as part of this development server which we're using. So here on the homepage component, we can then expect that we do get a products key on our props. So I can use object destructuring to pull products out of props. And I use products here because that's the key I used down there. And then we can render this list dynamically by accessing products and mapping that such that every product is mapped into a list item where the key is the product ID. So this ID we got down there. And as a value between the opening and closing list item tags, I output the title like this. And with this in place, if we now visit our Next.js application, we see product 1 here. Now, of course, we're currently not fetching that data from any file. I have it hard-coded in there, but we already implemented getStaticProps with that. And if we now again view the page source of this page, we see that this data, this product1 data, is part of the page that was sent to the client. So fetching that product data did not happen on the client, it happened on the server. And if we would dive into the Sources tab of the DevTools and look through the JavaScript code files, you wouldn't find that code anywhere in those files because it's not part of the code that's shipped to the client side. And that means that the code in getStaticProps can do server-side things because it's not executed on the client side. So you can use credentials which your users shouldn't see, and you can also run code that wouldn't work in the browser. Code that accesses the file system, for example. And that's exactly what we're going to do next. So we added getStaticProps with some dummy code, but at the moment we're really just, well, not doing anything that would require us to add that function. We could just prepare dummy data like this in the component function as well. Well, of course, I started with such a simple example to just get started with getStaticProps. A more realistic example would be that we have a data file like this dummy backend JSON file from which we want to load data. But we do want to load the data when the page is prepared. We don't want to reach out to that file through a HTTP request or anything like that from the client side. And therefore, we'll now utilize the fact that any code inside of getStaticProps is executed on the server side, so to say, with server-side capabilities. And that means that we can now, for example, work with the file system. For this, I'll add an import at the top, and I'll import fs from fs. Now this imports the file system module from Node.js. This is not a third-party package which we needed to install. It's one of the core Node.js modules instead. And working with the fs module would fail if you tried to do it on the client side, because browser-side JavaScript can't access the file system. And especially not our project file system here, because the entire project is not served to our visitors. But we can import this here nonetheless and use the file system module inside of getStaticProps. So we can use fs here. And Next.js is very clever and sees which imports you only use in getStaticProps or similar functions, which we'll learn about later. And then those imports are basically stripped out of the client-side code bundle. So when the code for the client side, the React app code for the browser side, when that is prepared, that import will not be part of it. Next.js will ignore it for the client side. It will split your code in a clever way. So the component code in general will be part of the client-side code. This import and this code won't be. And now we can use fs to get access to this dummy backend JSON file with the read file or the read file sync function. Read file sync synchronously reads the file and blocks the execution until it's done. Read file, on the other hand, wants a callback to continue. And we can actually also import the file system from fs/promises, which is a special version of this Node.js module that uses promises. And when we do so, read file actually returns a promise. And since this is an async function, we can then just await this. Now, read file just needs a path to the file which you want to read. So we can construct this path here, and this path, or let's name it file path, this path should lead to the dummy backend JSON file. Now, to construct this path, we can import another module from Node.js, the path module from path. And that's a module with helpful functionalities for building paths. Now here we can use path and execute the join method to build a path that can be consumed by read file. And here I want to start from inside the current directory and then basically work my way to this data directory and the dummy backend JSON file. Now for this, we basically want to dive into the data folder and then grab this dummy backend JSON file. And to do this, we first of all need to tell path join in which path we're starting. And we can get the current working directory by using another Node.js object or concept. And that's the process object, which is globally available in Node.js. And then on process, we can execute the CWD method, which stands for current working directory. And this gives you the current working directory of this code file when it's executed. Now, the important thing here is that this current working directory will not be the pages folder. Instead, when this file is executed, Next.js will be executing it, and it will basically treat all the files as if they sit in our root project folder. So the current working directory will be the overall project folder instead of the pages folder. That's important to know. So with that, we tell Node.js, or the path join method to be precise, that we start in this overall project directory. Then we add a comma, and the next argument is data, because we want to dive into the data folder. We want to build a path which starts at the current working directory, so the project directory, and then dives into the data directory. And then we add another argument. We can add an infinite amount of arguments here, which holds the file name we want to use. So in this case, dummy backend.json. This now builds an absolute path to this file, and that's now the path which we pass to read file. So this will now read this file. So with that, we get our JSON data from that JSON file. And now to get our actual data, we can call JSON parse on the JSON data. JSON is a globally available object, just as it is on the browser side. You can use it in Node.js as well. And this parses this JSON data. It converts it into a regular JavaScript object. And now that data will be an object with a products key, which holds an array. So now we can return our props, which are now based on that data. And the products, which are part of my props, are now data.products. So the products I fetch from this file are now passed as a value to products here in this object and are therefore ultimately passed through props to this component function when Next.js executes this function for us. But it will first of all go through that function. And hence now if we save everything and you reload localhost 3000, you'll see 3 products here. Again, if you view the page source, you see that all the data is there right from the start. Here it is. So it was pre-rendered. And it was pre-rendered with help of getStaticProps, which now executes a bunch of server-side code that never reaches the client. It's only executed when Next.js pre-renders our page. Now, up to this point, I explained a lot about pre-rendering and how Next.js does that. But we haven't really seen it in action other than on the running website in development mode. But I do want to show you what exactly Next.js does do for you when you build the application. Now, I did mention this build script before. This build script, that's a script you execute when you're ready to deploy your next application, your Next.js project. And this build step here, this next build command, which is executed in the end, this will then pre-generate your pages. And to show this to you, here I quit my development server and I'll run npm run build here. So I'll execute this build script and therefore next build in this project folder. And what you'll see now is that it's now creating that optimized production build, and that can take a couple of seconds. And after a while, this build process will complete. Now we get a couple of pieces of information here. We see that it was successful in the end, because we have no error here. And we see that it generated 2 static pages here. And we see the detailed output down there. We also have a legend here at the bottom telling us that a filled dot stands for static site generation. So for a pre-generated page that was pre-generated during development or during the build process, because it uses getStaticProps. A lambda symbol would stand for a server-side only page, something we're going to see later. An empty dot stands for static, so also a page pre-generated, but a page that doesn't even need any data and therefore doesn't use getStaticProps or anything like that. And if we scroll back up again, we see that in the end, the 2 pages that were pre-generated is the starting page, so /nothing, so index.js, and then a 404 page. We haven't added one, but you get one for free automatically. We can ignore this _app thing here. Now the 404 page has an empty dot, which means it was pre-generated without any data, which makes sense. We didn't add our own one, and the default one is not fetching any data. And index.js, so /nothing, was statically pre-generated with help of getStaticProps. That's why we have that filled dot here. That's how we can read this. And we can also see this if we have a look at the .next folder, which was generated now, which holds this production-ready code, so which holds the output of the npm run build command. Then in there we do have a server folder into which we can dive. And in there we see those pre-generated HTML files. The 2 pre-generated HTML files. And in index.html, if you open that, you also find that product data in the end in there. Because that's the pre-generated page, which we also see if we would visit this page in the browser. And that's that pre-generated page, which is sent back on the initial request to the search engine crawler or to the visitors of our page. And we can even preview this production-ready page here by running npm start. npm start starts the production-ready page with a Node.js server, and whilst we typically would do that on some remote computer to expose it to the world, we can also do that locally on our machine. And then again, it starts on localhost 3000, but this now is not the development server, but the real server serving the production-ready page. So if I visit localhost 3000, if I enter this in the browser, I still see this page with the pre-rendered products because we just saw that in the pages folder in this .next folder, which holds this production-ready site. Side note, in the page source, you also see there is some script tag injected by Next.js, which in the end includes that data with which the data was populated. That is needed for this hydration, where the pre-rendered HTML code is then connected with the React application. And that data which was prefetched is handed off to that React application so that the React application knows that this was dynamic data and which kind of data should be rendered. So that if you continued working with that data and you would be updating that data through React.js, React would know which kind of data was received originally. That's just a side note. It's all done automatically. We don't need to do anything for that, but that is how Next.js does work here and how it pre-renders pages for you. So we did learn about getStaticProps and how we can use it to prepare data on the server side, so to say, for pre-rendering the page. However, when I say on the server side, that's only partially correct. We can execute server-side code here, but in the end, the code will not run on the actual server which serves our application. Instead, it runs on our machine when the page is built, when the application is built with Next. So in the end, when you run npm run build, when you execute that prepared script here, which executes Next build, then this code is executed. Now, that's still good, because since we have Node.js installed, all that Node.js code does work here, so that's perfect, but it has one potential downside. What if you have data that changes frequently? Because, pre-generating the pages sounds great if you're building something fairly static. If you're building a blog where data doesn't change too often, then, of course, whenever you add a new blog post, you can just pre-generate your project again, you can run npm run build again, and deploy the updated project. So that would work. But if you have data that changes more frequently, if we add a fourth product here after the page was deployed, then we have to rebuild and redeploy the page all the time. And that doesn't sound like a great thing to do. Well, Next.js also has solutions for this. Solution number one is that you do pre-build your page, but then you still include standard React code in your React components, where you use useEffect for then fetching updated data from a server. So you would always serve back a page with some pre-rendered data, but that data might be outdated, so you fetch the latest data in the background and then update the loaded page after that data arrived. That's a pattern you could implement. Then you at least show something to your users, but it might be a bit outdated, but that's why you're fetching data in the background so that you can update the page with the latest data once you get that. That might be a perfectly valid pattern. But there is an alternative which often is better. This getStaticProps function, as I mentioned, does execute when you build your project with Next build, so with this build script. Well, that's not entirely true. It does execute there, but that is not necessarily the only time it executes. Instead, Next.js has a built-in feature which is called incremental static generation. It means that you don't just generate your page statically once at build time, but that it's continuously updated even after deployment without you redeploying it. So you pre-generate a page, but then you can also tell Next.js that a given page should be regenerated again for every incoming request, at most every X seconds. So every 60 seconds, for example. That means that if a request is made for a certain page and it's, let's say, less than 60 seconds since it was last regenerated, the existing page would be served to the visitor. But if it's past those 60 seconds, and the amount of seconds, of course, is up to you, then this page would be pre-generated on the server instead. So that means that you either serve the old page if it's not that old yet, or you serve the latest page and brand new page which was generated again on the server otherwise. And if that page was pre-generated again on the server because it was outdated, then this newly generated page will replace the existing old page on the server. It will be cached, and future visitors will see that regenerated page instead, until 60 seconds passed again and a new page is pre-generated again. So you can have ongoing pre-rendering on the server for incoming requests. And all you need to do to unlock this is in the object which you return in getStaticProps, you don't just return props, but you also add a second key which is called revalidate. And as a value, you set a number here, which is the time in seconds that Next.js should wait until it regenerates this page. So for example, if I enter 10 here, we would tell Next.js that for every incoming request to this page, it should be regenerated unless it's less than 10 seconds ago that it was last regenerated. So it's recreated at most once every 10 seconds. And of course, the higher that this number is, the less this page will be regenerated. And it's totally up to you which value you want here. It will of course depend on which kind of application you're building. For a highly dynamic page where content changes all the time, you want a very low value, maybe just 1 second. For pages where the content is less dynamic, maybe 10 minutes is enough. So that is then really something you have to decide. Now, during development, the page will be regenerated for every request, no matter what you enter here. So with the development server, we will always see the latest page with the latest data, and this will always run again. But in production, this number will matter. So here, if I add regenerating here in a console log instead of getStaticProps, if I now rerun the development server, we will see here in this terminal, since that is the server-side terminal, so to say, we see regenerating because I started the dev server, so that's equivalent to the build process. It was now pre-generated. But if I now visit this page by reloading, for example, we see this again. Because as I just said, during development, the revalidate number doesn't matter. It will regenerate it every time. In production, it will matter, and then you have the best of both worlds. You have a pre-rendered page, which then still is updated after deployment, just as defined by you. Now, just as before, I also want to show you this revalidation in production, so to say. So again, we're going to execute this build script here, now that we did add revalidate to our getStaticProps return object. And keep in mind that we have this console log statement in here. So now if I run npm run build, again, this entire project is prepared for production, and Next.js goes ahead and pre-renders pages, but it will now also do this incremental static generation here. And if we scroll up a bit, what we indeed see is that we're generating static pages here as part of the build process, and that was done before as well. We therefore see our regenerating console log statement here. But then you also see that this option here is checked for ISR, which stands for incremental static regeneration. And here we see that 10 seconds is logged in. So basically Next.js recognized that we set this to 10 seconds here, and hence it is aware that this page /nothing, so the starting page, the index page, should be regenerated every 10 seconds. That's what it's saying here. So it's aware of that. Now we can run our build website here locally on our machine with npm start. So not npm run dev, that would start the development server with better debugging support and so on. But with npm start, we can run this build production ready site. So after npm run build, we can run npm start to view this production ready site on our local machine. So now I started this prepared page, and if we now visit localhost 3000 in the browser, because that production demo server here still runs on localhost 3000, as you see here. If we visit that, we see our product data here. So we see this pre-rendered page, which makes sense because it was pre-rendered as part of the build process. But if I now reload this page here, you see regenerating here in this log, in this terminal. And keep in mind that this terminal represents the server side, because here I started the server with npm start. So what we see here is output from the code that runs on the server. And since we see regenerating here after we built our project with npm run build, this proves that indeed getStaticProps was executed again on the server which is running our production ready site. So exactly what I explained over and over again over the last lectures, you see it in action here. This getStaticProps function did run again on the server, not in the browser and not during the build process, but on the server after it was deployed, so to say, with npm start. And therefore we see this was revalidated. It was rebuilt because of our 10 seconds setting. Now I talked more than 10 seconds, so if I reload this again, we again see regenerating. If I quickly reload again a couple of times though, we don't see 10 times regenerating here though, because I was below those 10 seconds. So I hope this all makes sense and it's clear how that works. Now before we explore more static functions Next.js offers to us and when we need them, let's take another closer look at getStaticProps. On this slide you see that I added a parameter called context there. Because indeed, this function, which is called by Next.js, receives an argument. We just haven't used it thus far. But we do actually get an object here as an argument, as a parameter, with some extra information about this page when it's executed by Next.js. For example, we would get any dynamic params, any dynamic path segment values, which we'll see in a second, so we'll ignore that for now. And we also get a couple of other pieces of information, which at the moment though don't matter to us. So let's ignore this for now. You will see context in action throughout the next lectures though. Instead, let's take a closer look at this return object again. In there, we see props and revalidate. Now there are two other keys which you can set on this object. One key is the not found key, which wants a Boolean value which is either true or false. If you set this to true, this page will return a 404 error and therefore render the 404 error page instead of the normal page. So if I add not found true here and save this, if we reload, we get the 404 page. Now, why might we want to do that? Well, if the code here, where you fetch data, fails to fetch the data for whatever reason, then you could, for example, do that. So we could check if data products length, if that is 0, so if we have no products, then maybe we want to return an object here in getStaticProps, which has not found set to true, so that we show the not found page. And only if we have at least one product in the fetched data, we return the regular page. That would be a typical use case where you sometimes want to render the 404 page because you failed to fetch data. So if I save this and reload, now I see that page again because of course we do have products. Another key you can set is the redirect key. The redirect key allows you to redirect the user. So instead of rendering the page content, instead of rendering this component content, you can redirect to another page, to another route. And that could also be needed because maybe you failed to fetch data. Let's say the problem is not that there is no data, but instead you weren't able to access the database or anything like that. So if there is no data to begin with, so not just no products, but no data in general, then maybe you want to redirect. And you can do this by returning an object where the redirect key is set to an object where you then set a destination to some route, for example, to the no data route, which we don't have here, but which you could have in a project of yours, of course, and where then therefore that route would be loaded with a redirect status code returned by Next.js instead of this page component. Now we don't need either of the two here, but I wanted to mention them here so that you are aware of these special options, which basically can come in handy if something goes wrong with fetching your data. And with that, that's enough for getStaticProps for this very moment. Let's now have a look at another very important use case and very important problem you often face in Next.js projects. In this project which we have here, we currently have only one page, the index.js page. Now there we're rendering some dummy product data. And it's very simple dummy product data, of course. Now what if our data there was a bit more complex? So every product also had a description, let's say. And I'll keep this very simple here since I want to focus on the Next.js features, not on this concrete example. So here the description is, this is product 1. It's one extra JSON key added here. And on the second product, this is product 2. And you might be able to imagine what it will be on the third product. Yes, this is product 3. Now the idea could be that on the index.js file, we render a list of products, and every product is a clickable link, which takes us to a detail page where we then also see the description of the product. So similar to what we built before in our project with the events, we have a detail page for the products. And for this, we can of course add a new page with a dynamic segment between square brackets. And here we could name this PID for product ID, but that identifier is up to you, .js. So that's now a dynamic page. Alternatively, we create a folder named PID like this, and in there we then have an index.js file, but I'll stick to this setup. And here we could now add a component function, which is the product detail page, let's say. And the idea is that in this component, on this page, we show the product details. So to keep this simple, I just want to return, let's say, a fragment here, imported from React. And there I then have a h1 tag with the title of the product, and below that a paragraph with the description. But that data should now be fetched from the dummy backend JSON file as well. Now again, of course, we could write standard React code here, so to say, and use useEffect, imported from React, to send a HTTP request to some server which might provide this product data. But then we're back in the world where that data is not there when this page is initially rendered. So search engines still wouldn't see it. So that's not what we'll do here. Instead, what we will do here is we will again use this async prop function. So we'll export this async function getStaticProps. This function is again a function we can use here. And here we then again want to reach out to the backend JSON file, but now instead of reading the entire file and returning all products, I want to read the file and only return one product from that file. That will be the difference. And therefore, of course, we need to know which product should be returned here. And of course, that's something we can determine by looking at the concrete value, which is in the URL. So the concrete value for this PID key here. That's where this context parameter again becomes important, because I did briefly mention before that we can use this context parameter, which is exposed to us by Next.js, to get hold of the concrete parem values, so the concrete values for these dynamic segments in our paths. We do get access to that by having a look at the parems key in context. Now that's not a name I came up with. Instead, that is one of the properties exposed by this context object, which is given to you by Next.js. And parems is an object full of key value pairs where the keys are the identifiers for the dynamic path segments. So in this case, PID, which is the only dynamic parameter of this page here. And the values are the concrete values that were entered in the URL. So here I then get my product ID by accessing parems.pid, PID, because that's what I picked here on the file name. Now one quick note about extracting the parems here to avoid confusion. Of course, you can also extract parems through the useRouter hook inside of the component function. That's what we did before in this course. We got access to that router object with the useRouter hook, and we extracted parems with router.query. Now, there is a difference between extracting parems in the component function and in getStaticProps. When we extract these parems in the component function, we can use them inside of the component, for example, to use that extracted ID to send a request to some backend server to fetch data from there. But that would then only happen in the browser. If we want to pre-render a page with help of getStaticProps, which we use to prepare the data for pre-rendering the page, then this happens on the server. And as I explained, getStaticProps runs before the component function runs. It needs to run before that because the component function is then executed to pre-render the page. So if you plan on preparing a page on the server or during the build process with getStaticProps, then you need to get access to the parems, so to that dynamic path segment inside of getStaticProps, so that you can use the parem data here to prepare the data for the component. Then we don't need to extract that dynamic segment in the component function, unless we also need it there for some reason. But for preparing the data, we then want to do that in getStaticProps. And now with that, we could reach out to our file, to the dummy backend JSON file, and try to read that product with that ID. So for this, I'll briefly copy that code from index.js, where I get access to this dummy backend JSON file. And I'll therefore also grab those imports here and add them to pid.js like this. And now that we got hold of this file, I just want to filter my data, the products in there to be precise, for a product with this ID. So here I'll then get my product by reaching out to data products and calling find there. And then we pass a function to find, which is executed on every product in that array. And we want to return true here if the ID of the product we're currently looking at in that array is equal to the product ID we got here from our parameters. And if that is equal, we know that's the product we need for this component. So then here at the end of getStaticProps, we return an object with the props key. And here I then set my loaded product, let's say, equal to the product fetched here. Now there is a loaded product props available inside of the product detail page. So here we can extract this, maybe again with object destructuring. We can get this from the props, which we should accept therefore. And then it's this loaded product from which we can read the title and the description. So here it's then loaded product.description. Now, in order to test this, we need to make sure we can go to this detail page. And there from the index.js file, I will wrap the text inside of the list item with the link component, which of course needs to be imported again from next link. So that still needs to be imported. Then I move the product title between those link tags. And then ref is set to a dynamic value, which I construct with a template literal, where I want to go to slash and then inject the product ID here. And with that, if we now save all, we got clickable links here. And if I click on a link, I get an error. Get static paths is required. Now, that is an expected error, and it's an important one. So let's understand what it does. But before we do that, in the next lecture, I again want to emphasize that the code here is generally correct. We use params to get access to the concrete values encoded in the URL, and we can then use that extracted data to fetch a specific piece of data and expose this to the component. So this is not wrong, and still we have this problem. So let's understand where this is coming from. So what's up with this error? Now the good thing is, this error actually tells us the solution, though of course we don't really understand why we need that solution. Well, keep in mind that currently Next.js is pre-generating all the pages, and I mentioned that it would pre-generate pages by default. It turns out this is not the case if you have a dynamic page. So where the name of the component has such square brackets, if you have a dynamic segment leading to that page. If you have that, the default behavior is not to pre-generate the page. And why is that not the default? Because keep in mind that technically for this page, we won't just have one page, but multiple pages. For different IDs, we have technically different pages which have kind of the same frame and the same general HTML content, but different data. This page can be loaded for /p1/p2/p1000. So Next.js doesn't know in advance how many pages it needs to pre-generate for this dynamic page. It doesn't know which values for PID will eventually be supported. And because it doesn't know that, dynamic pages like this are not pre-generated by default. Instead, they are always generated just in time on the server, which is why it worked before. But it's now not working anymore because we added getStaticProps. And as I mentioned, when you add this function to a page component file, then you tell Next.js that you want to pre-render this page in advance. For index.js, that didn't make a difference. There it was the default anyways. But for this dynamic page, it does make a difference because there it was not the default. For the reasons mentioned, Next.js has no chance of knowing how many pages you need and which concrete values of this dynamic segment you need. That's why for such dynamic routes, we need to give Next.js more information. We can also tell Next.js which paths, so which instances of a dynamic page should be pre-generated. Because here we don't just need data, we also need to let Next.js know which ID values, which dynamic segment values will be available, and for which values a page should be pre-generated, so that multiple instances of that page blueprint can be pre-generated by Next.js. And we do inform Next.js about this with another function we can add on the page. So another function we can add in this page file. And that's the getStaticPaths function, which also is async. So where you can also use the await keyword. And just as getStaticProps, that's a function which you can add to your page component files and only there, so not in any other component files. And you need to export it to make Next.js aware of it. And now let's explore how this function works and how we use it. So let's solve this error with the getStaticPaths function. For this, in our PID.js file, I simply export another function, another async function called getStaticPaths. And just like getStaticProps, you must make sure that you have no typo in there, because Next.js will look for this function specifically. Now, the goal of this function is to tell Next.js which instances of this dynamic page should be generated. Therefore, this should return an object, just as getStaticProps does, but an object with different kinds of values. An object where you have a paths key. And that's now an array full of objects. So that is a given structure which you must return here. Now in this object, you must add a params key now, and that holds another object where you have a bunch of key value pairs, where the keys are all the different dynamic segment identifiers that might lead to this page. If that would be nested deeper in a folder where the folder name is also dynamic, you could have multiple identifiers. Here it's only one, so PID. And the values are then the concrete values for which this page should be generated. So here, for example, we know that we want to generate this page 3 times for P1, P2, and P3 as values for this dynamic page identifier here. And therefore, I'll set PID here to P1. And then I will repeat that. So now we just create another object where params is set to another object with PID P2. And we now repeat this a third time here. So another object where params is then set to P3, like this. Now this tells Next.js that this dynamic page here should be pre-generated 3 times with these 3 values as a value for this dynamic segment identifier. And then Next.js will call getStaticProps 3 times for these different IDs, and we then can extract that ID like this inside of this function. Now for this to work, we also need to add another key next to paths, and that's the fallback key, which for the moment should be set to false. I'll come back to that later. For the moment, set it to false, and then if you save everything, you will see that if you load localhost 3000/P2, for example, you have the product2 page. If I go back to the starting page and I click on product3, I have product3 data here. And now that is displayed correctly and successfully because it was pre-generated successfully by Next.js. And therefore, getStaticPaths is required to tell Next.js which concrete instances of this dynamic page must be pre-generated.